Hello, everyone. Today we're going to start talking about qualitative research, which is the other major paradigm besides quantitative. And we'll also talk about the third emerging paradigm, which is mixed methods, where quantitative and qualitative research methods come together and are integrated. We've spent the first third of the semester talking mostly about quantitative research designs. Last week, we spent time talking about experiments. You saw Stanley Milgram's experiment in the obedience to authority and did a great job identifying the dependent and independent variables as well as the hypothesis. And as you know, experimental research in particular examines cause and effect. Qualitative research tends to be much more exploratory and descriptive. Researchers are interested in capturing the quality of an activity or a phenomenon, describing the lived experiences of people or participants. And qualitative research is mostly concerned with the quality or qualities of relationships, for example, situations, activities. And so there's a greater emphasis on holistic description. Some qualitative researchers refer to this as thick, rich description, which usually includes verbatim quotes and other types of evidence that are based on mostly words, sometimes images. Quantitative data, as you know, are numerical, such as statistics. Qualitative data tend to be captured through words, sometimes images, and the outcome or the product for qualitative inquiry includes interview transcripts, notes, observational notes, usually narrative products. And as I mentioned earlier, together qualitative and quantitative can be complementary research paradigms. Now in this slide, which is also a table in your textbook, there are very specific differences that are delineated between quantitative and qualitative methods. I'm not going to read through all of them, but a few of them that I wanted to highlight include the first one. So in quantitative methods, as you know, in the Milgram study, experimental research, and also correlational and sometimes survey research, a hypothesis is stated at the outset. So the approach to knowledge production tends to be deductive. There is a general statement of interest, and then at the very end, a very specific confirmation, or in some cases, disconfirmation of the initial idea or hypothesis. Qualitative inquiry tends to be a lot more inductive, where there's a specific idea that's stated, sometimes as a proposition, that then gets looked at in a more general way. So the reasoning flows from specific or particular to general. And the purpose of doing qualitative research in general is to produce theory, as opposed to confirm or disconfirm a hypothesis. Because qualitative methods tend to be more exploratory, it would be inappropriate to state a hypothesis at the outset. Now, I have encouraged you to think about stating a proposition. And as I mentioned a few weeks ago, for some qualitative absolutists or purists, it would be inappropriate to state a proposition in that it might obscure or prevent the researcher from looking in places because the propositions tend to focus inquiry or data collection. My preference as a mixed methodologist, as somebody who's a pragmatist, is to state a proposition, which you know is sort of a watered down or a tentative hypothesis, because those statements can help guide your data collection so that you're not overwhelmed when you're in the field collecting data. So for quantitative methods, the preference is to state the hypothesis at the outset. For qualitative, the preference is to let the hypothesis emerge as the study develops. And there's also the use of propositions to help guide data collection in qualitative methods. The data for quantitative tend to be reduced to numerical scores. In qualitative methods, the preference is for narrative products or description. And at the very end of the study, typically qualitative researchers identify themes, which then may or may not be placed or reduced into categories. But the preference again is for narrative products or outcomes. Validity is important for both quantitative and qualitative. But in qualitative, there's also a process referred to as triangulation, where you use not 3, but 2 or more sources to check the validity of information that you're getting from a primary source. The type of sampling involved in quantitative methods privileges or prefers random processes. But in qualitative methods, a lot of selection, a lot of thought goes into who to select for the sample. So it's anything but random, and the process tends to be more purposive. In quantitative methods, there's a great deal of manipulation on the part of the researcher. So for example, participants who are randomly selected, ideally, are then placed in either a control group or a treatment group. And aspects of the study are tightly controlled. The ideal situation would be for it to be a laboratory so that external stimuli or processes could not interfere or interrupt the study. Qualitative methods, there is more of a acceptance of naturally occurring situations or phenomena. So qualitative researchers tend to be a lot more flexible and dynamic in the way that they interact with their participants and in the process of collecting data. There's greater acceptance of the fact that we don't live in a laboratory and that certain things will occur that may affect the outcome of the study. And so qualitative researchers are much more adaptable to that sort of interruption. So as I mentioned, qualitative research tends to be more naturalistic. The focus is on words primarily, but also images or pictures. The researchers are concerned with how or why things occur, and there tends to be more of a exploratory compared to confirmatory approach to collecting information. The ideal situation for a qualitative researcher is to get inside the mind of participants, to get beyond the party line, to really be able to tap into the lived experience of the individuals, for example, if they were trying to report on participants' experiences in a community, for example. In many ways, the steps for qualitative also are similar to quantitative in that you're identifying the topic or phenomenon, you're including, you're deciding on who to include in the study, and that type of sampling is usually called purposive. You state a proposition rather than a hypothesis, and then through the collection and analysis of data, you come up with conclusions through interpretation. And usually that process leads to the development of theory. Different approaches and types that you've read about include biographical, phenomenological, grounded theory, case study, and teacher or research, action research. I'm going to speak mostly about the last 3. Grounded theory or ethnography allows the truth or ideas to emerge or bubble up from the data that are being collected, to be open to ideas that come up as a result of being involved in the study. So rather than having any preconceived ideas, i.e. hypotheses, grounded theory is an approach where you simply observe or listen and see what transpires and what comes up in the course of collecting information. Case study tends to be more mixed, as you know, so it's primarily qualitative, but it can also include quantitative information. And the point is to go very deep into a particular case. And the unit of analysis is one that the researcher stipulates. So it can be an individual, it can be a classroom, a school, could be a nation. And certainly you could do dual case studies where you compare two or more cases. And the approach tends to be multi-perspectival in that you're trying to gather a lot of information about a singular case that you identify, and then to go very deep in the analysis of those data. Lastly, teacher action research. And again, I'm encouraging those of you who are in elementary or early elementary, secondary, or have access to students in classrooms to use teacher action research, which also tends to be mixed but primarily qualitative as far as identifying problems in practice that are soluble. And the idea is to come up with a pragmatic plan that can be put in place to address the problem. Generalization in qualitative research tends to be very different than generalizability in quantitative studies. Most quantitative studies seek to generalize beyond the group of people in which data have been obtained. That process is called statistical generalizability, where through the process usually of identifying a sample, ideally in a random sample, the findings for that sample are then extended out to the entire population to whom the researcher would like to generalize. Because sampling in qualitative research tends to be more purposive and thus includes selection criteria that both include and exclude participants, there's less likelihood that the qualitative researcher, can generalize from sample to a larger population. But that doesn't mean that this qualitative researcher is not interested in generalizability. Far from that. So there's a greater push now among qualitative researchers to push for transferability, or what I call theoretical generalizability. The idea is that if the qualitative researcher provides a lot of thick, rich description, relevant details about the sample, for example, vivid information or details about the study, procedures, and process, there's a greater likelihood then that the reader, that the consumer of the research or the report, can then generalize on behalf of the researcher. So the key distinction is who generalizes. In quantitative research, typically it's the researcher generalizing from sample to population. In qualitative research, the hope is that the reader will then be able to take away some truth or findings that can then improve his or her own practice. So in qualitative research, the researcher does not generalize, does not make those claims that the findings from this study can then generalize to a larger group of people. The researcher provides the information so that the reader can generalize on his or her behalf. And that process is called transferability or theoretical generalizability. Now, rather than talk about qualitative and quantitative combined, I'm going to stop here and allow you to move to the next part of our activities, in-class activities. So if you could return back to the iLearn site, there will be a link there for a video that you can watch.